All right. Oops, wrong one. There we go. All right. A little bit slower getting started than I was expecting, but we're here. We are ready to go. We've even got captions. Woo! And it's time for Chapter 6, The Mystery of the Maya. So hopefully we're getting into the Neanderthal part of it, because he hasn't mentioned them yet at all. Well, maybe he mentioned them once, but he hasn't talked about them at all. So, kind of wondering where the kingdom of the Neanderthals comes in. All right. After he had dinner with a Mayan specialist in Paris, Maurice Chatelaine. I'll just do the American pronunciation. The NASA scientist who investigated the Nineveh number decided to look a little more closely at the Mayan people, who had appeared in Mexico about 300 BC and vanished from history about 900 AD. The Maya were a paradox. They had not even discovered the wheel, yet their calendar and knowledge of astronomy suggested that they were intellectual supermen. From Chatelaine's point of view, one of the most impressive things about them was that they knew a version of the Nineveh number with its 15 digits. Actually, I'm sorry. Let me pause for just a moment. I'm going to go off camera. I'm not going to pause it. I will be right back. Can the world shut? Alrighty. Sorry about that. Dead air for a moment. All right. They knew a version of the Nineveh number with its 15 digits. Here again, as with the original Nineveh number, archaeologists had discovered immense numbers engraved on stone in Mayan temples. Period. Two of these numbers were found in one of the Maya's most sacred places, Quirigua in Guatemala. I've never heard of that one. At the time these numbers were discovered, Europeans believed that the world had been created in 4004 BC, a date arrived at by the Archbishop James Ussher by adding together all the dates in the Bible. No scholars paid any attention to such huge numbers, but when Chatelain looked at them, 34 how do I read that? Okay, 34,020 million. So 1,000 million. So 34 million 20 no 34 billion 20 million, and 147,420 million, so 147 billion 420 million. He was intrigued. He guessed the numbers represented days, since the Mayans counted in days. This made the first about 93 million years, and the other a little more than 403 million years. I don't get. Oh, I forgot. In Europe, they use a comma instead of a decimal. So 34.2 million and 147.420 million maybe is what I was supposed to read. I apologize. If I'm wrong, let me know. All right, he guessed the numbers represented days since the Mayas counted in days. This made the first about 93 million years and the other a little more than 403 million years. Chatelain soon realized that the first is 15 times the Nineveh number, while the other is 65 times. That meant, of course, that the Maya must have been familiar with the precession of the equinoxes. Who were these amazing people? Well, they had been discovered, or rather rediscovered, by a Spanish friar named Ramon de Ordonez. Ordonez? I don't know. Who lived in the town of Ciudad Real in Chiapas, southern Mexico, and who in 1773 was told about a city overgrown by the jungle about 70 miles away. In the midst of the jungle, he discovered magnificent ruins, including a kind of pyramid. In a place that eventually became known as Palenque, Ordonez called it the City of the Serpents because carvings of serpents had been reported there. Ordonez had read something. Oh, hello. Uh, be chills. You gotta follow the rules, man. Ordonez had read something about the city's founder, a man named Votan, in a Maya book written in the Quiche language. The book had been discovered about 1690 in a temple, and the local bishop, Nunez de la Vega, had quickly burned it. Fortunately, he had copied some of it before he burned it, so Friar Ordonez was able to discover a little of its contents. Votan was a tall, bearded man who had arrived in the New World many centuries earlier. His native city in the Middle East was called Valam Chivim. The manuscript described that during one of his 4 trips home, Votan had visited a city where the residents were attempting to build a tower that would reach to the sky. If this was the Tower of Babel, then the city would have been Babylon, and the date perhaps 2500 BC. This link to Babylon then might possibly explain how the Maya, who accepted Votan as their ruler and teacher, came to know the Nineveh number. The Maya regarded Votan as a god. His symbol was the serpent. He also became known under other names, Viracocha, Kontiki, and Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. In the sunken temple in front of the Calasacia in Tiwanaku is a statue of a tall, bearded European who is assumed to be the great teacher Viracocha. He must have been European, since native Indians cannot grow beards. If the statue is indeed of Viracocha, and the town of Tiwanaku dated from before 10,000 BC, then Votan probably arrived in the New World long before the building of Babylon. And since another legend states that the white god arrived from the east after some great natural catastrophe, it is even conceivable that he was talking about someone who escaped the Atlantis flood. Of course, all this could be dismissed as speculation, but one thing is definitely not speculation, that the Maya knew a version of the Nineveh number, the precession number. In 1841, the Mayan culture achieved the fame it deserved when a young American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens decided to go to Mexico and see the famous ruins for himself. Stephen was already known for his travels in the Middle East, and his book, Incidents of Travel in South America, brought him overnight celebrity. The book's illustrations of jungle cities by Stephen's friend James Catherwood introduced the rest of the world to the architecture of the Maya. These Mexican Indians, who developed a more precise calendar than anyone else, even more exact than the Romans, whose Julian calendar was 365 days long, had a year that was 365.2420 days long. This kind of accuracy is astounding. How could the early Maya, the so-called classic Maya, who built cities in the jungle before they mysteriously abandoned them around 890 AD, want a calendar as accurate as that? Our own modern measurements of the year, based on the cesium clock, is 365.2422 days long, 2/10,000ths of a day longer. Moreover, the Maya had invented a symbol for zero, which is regarded as a basic essential in mathematics, yet neither the Greeks nor the Romans had a zero. This may hardly seem important, but without the decimal system, counting in tens, it is impossible to arrange numbers in columns of 10, each column 10 times the previous one. When the Romans wanted to write a figure like 1944, they had to write MCMXLIV. Mayan astronomy is awe-inspiring. It is so complex and precise that some Martian scholar who had stumbled on it by chance might well conclude that the Maya were Earth's greatest scientists. We calculate the year by the sun, so did the Maya, but they also calculated it by the planet Venus, as well as by Jupiter-Saturn cycles. As to our earthly year, they solved the problem that the Egyptians, the Greeks, and even the Romans had failed to solve by having no less than three distinct calendars. They had a sun calendar of 360 days, to which they added 5 supernumerary days, although, as already noted, they knew the exact length of the solar year. A lunar year of 354 days, and a special sacred calendar of 260 days called the Tzolk'in, used for magical and ritual purposes. This was divided into 13 months of 20 days each. I'm actually going to write that down. I've never heard of the Tzolk'in and I want to look it up. So, bear with me. Sorry. Tzolk'in. TZ. Where is it? Where is it? Damn it. Oh, Tzolkin. Tzolkin. Maya of 260 days. Just so I know what the heck I'm writing that note down for, I've got to have a little bit of detail there. All right, so these 3 cycles ran concurrently, but since it is obvious that the Tzolk'in was well into its second year when the ordinary year had only just come to an end, their century was a total cycle in which the 3 lesser cycles had finally caught up with one another. This was 52 years long. The Venus year, 584 days long, caught up with the other every 2 Mayan centuries, 104 years. There was still another calendar called the long count, I've heard of that one, used to calculate long periods of time. Its unit, as we have noted, was 20 days. 360 days was a ton, 20 tons was a katon, and 20 katons was a bakton, which is 144,000 days. 13 baktons equaled one great cycle, or one Earth age, at the end of which everything would be destroyed and start all over again. The present Earth cycle began in 3114 BC and will end in December 2012 AD. Remember, this is a fairly old book. And that reminds me, I know we're talking about the Maya here, but if you've ever read any of Blavatsky's stuff, like Isis Unveiled or The Secret Doctrine, which I've not finished either of them. I've started reading both of them, and I got sidetracked. Anyway, in one of the two, I don't remember which, he talks about in India, their calendar and the yugas, which has a real parallel to this, especially the 144,000 days, really stands out to me. But one of the things I remember is that the belief is that the universe is born from the god Brahma breathing out, exhaling, and creating the universe with the exhale. And when he inhales, it destroys the universe. So this everything being destroyed and then starting over again just reminds me of that. And it's a little bit of a parallel. Anyway, the Maya also knew of the existence of Uranus and Neptune, although neither was discovered in Europe until the mid-19th century. Robert Temple is inclined to believe they had some form of telescope. This also applies to the Sumerians, who represented Saturn with a ring around it, although it cannot be seen with the naked eye. The strange thing is that as civilization builders, the Maya were not particularly remarkable. Professor Eric J. Thompson, the leading 20th century expert on the Maya, points out that this civilization, which had displayed such amazing astronomical knowledge, had still failed to invent the wheel or the curved arch, or even to weigh a sack of corn. Moreover, as many scholars have noted, the Maya simply failed to evolve or progress. Their late art and architecture looks much the same as the earlier. For then, the Maya themselves claimed that their knowledge originally came from Votan, who arrived after some great catastrophe. What happened to Votan, alias Viracocha, Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, and Kontiki? The legend says he was driven out again as a result of plots against him and sailed away on a raft to the west, promising to return one day, and even specifying where he would land. And so, when by an incredible chance the Spaniard Hernan Cortes and his small band of soldiers landed on the same beach at Veracruz in 1519, the Aztecs, the descendants of the Maya, assumed him to be the god teacher and allowed themselves to be conquered and overthrown. And this incredible, almost unbelievable coincidence makes us aware of why the Indians of Central America were so obsessed by the stars. They had absolutely no doubt that the heavens foretold the future. But there was another reason: irrational terror. They were terrified that one day they would wake up and the sun would fail to appear over the horizon. Then the wind would rise and the rain would fall in torrents, and the earth would be drowned in a great flood, as it had been more than once before. It was this fear of a time when the sky fell, quote unquote, that made them so fixated on the calendar, for the calendar dictated the time for religious observances when the gods had to be propitiated. And their method of bribing the gods was human sacrifice. Excuse me. Human sacrifice. Where? Oh, there we go. The victim was held down on a stone slab, and the priest made an incision in the chest with a flint knife. Then a hand was plunged into the ribs, the beating heart was torn out and held aloft. Which explains why the Spaniards who invaded Mexico and later Peru had so little compunction about torturing and killing these superstitious savages. They felt that anyone who habitually ripped out living hearts deserved whatever they got. Just how bloodily and cruelly the Spaniards did this can be seen in William H. Prescott's History of the Conquest of Mexico, which takes an extremely strong stomach to read. We are inclined to feel sorry for the Aztecs, successors of the Maya, until we hear about how their eighth emperor, Ahuitzotl, ordered the sacrifice of 80,000 prisoners to dedicate a temple when the gutters ran with blood. The massacre took 4 days of non-stop killing. The priests then flayed the corpses and lubricated their own naked bodies with their fat before pulling on the skin like a wetsuit. The slaughterers and their families followed this up with a cannibal feast. To say that all this was done in the spirit of a religious piety is obviously absurd. Any criminologist knows that sadistic murder becomes an addiction. Yeah, I'd say. I'd never heard it quite that graphic. I heard about the pulling out hearts and stuff, and the cannibalism, but not the rest. Wow. In his book, The Mayan Factor, the artist and Maya specialist Jose Arguelles, I don't speak Spanish, sorry, so argues that such a description does not apply to the Maya, although he concedes that there are artistic representations of prisoners, but he adds in their defense, quote, more important than territoriality and making war was the need to track the cycles of the planet Earth by means of a unique mathematical system, end quote. The problem with this is that the Maya did not work out the cycles of the planet for themselves. They learned it from some remarkable teacher, so they cannot really take credit for it. When the great Maya expert Sylvanus Griswold Morley calls them, quote, the most brilliant Aboriginal people on the planet, end quote, he is overpraising them for something they learned by rote, and they preserved their knowledge out of fear of the end of the world. Their failure to develop the wheel is surely a more accurate measure of their intellectual capacity. In a city with long avenues and immense plazas, you need to be fairly dim not to recognize that an ox cart will make life a great deal easier. As to where the Maya learned their astronomy, as good a guess as any is the Olmecs. These Aboriginal Mexicans, dating back to perhaps 2000 BC, were a late discovery. In 1884, archaeologist Alfredo Chavero discovered giant stone heads on the Gulf of Mexico in a swampy area south of Veracruz. In the early 1930s, Matthew W. Sterling found the source of the heads at a place called La Venta, a wooded hill rising in the middle of a swamp. The undergrowth proved to conceal a cone-shaped pyramid almost 100 feet high. Sterling also found huge altars and more stone heads. These were of a powerful negroid face with thick, sensual lips. Some archaeologists later suggested that they might be portraits of African slaves, but somehow the heads had too much character to be slaves. Besides, who would commission a 60-ton head of a slave? On the whole, it seemed more likely that these heads were intended as portraits of gods or men of importance. Finally, La Venta was identified as the city of the Olmecs, a formerly unknown group of Mexican Indians. It seemed to date from about 1200 BC. They also worshipped Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, so presumably their ancestors had been taught by him. One of their main deities was a were-jaguar. Their white pyramid was an observatory which had been realigned several times over the years, proving that Olmec astronomers recognized the celestial changes due to precession. So it seems fairly certain that it was the Olmecs who passed on knowledge of precession of the equinoxes to the Maya and their knowledge of the calendar. Since we know that the Olmecs carried out human sacrifices just like the Maya and the Aztecs, it seems that they shared the same fear of another great catastrophe. This is why they were so obsessed by the accuracy of their calendar. One of the most impressive attempts to explain this obsession is made by a remarkable engineer named Maurice Cotterell. When in the merchant navy, Cotterell was fascinated to note how often his fellow mariners behaved in a manner you might expect from their astrological signs. In fact, most people who know a little about astrology have probably observed how often Tauruses are stubborn, Geminis changeable, Leos dominant, Libras charming. Are Libras charming? And so on. But scientific studies have shown that this cannot be dismissed as superstition. In 1946, radio engineer John Nelson set up a study of the influence of the sun on radio interference and finally established the astonishing fact that the planets and their positions were also involved. When two or more planets were spaced 120 degrees apart, conditions were good, while 90 degrees and 180 degrees caused problems. Astrologers have always regarded trines, 120 degrees, as favorable, while quarters and oppositions, 90 and 180, are unfavorable. In 1950, a statistician named Michel, I don't know, Gaquilin, fed astrological data into his computer and discovered that while many astrological beliefs are nonsense, some have a sound factual basis. These included the notion that people born in the odd months, Aries, Gemini, Leo, etc., are extroverts, while those born in the even months are introverts, and that a person's choice of professions is governed by their rising sign, the constellation coming up over the horizon when they are born. Gauquelin discovered that the first is statistically valid and the second has some basis in fact. Sportsmen tend to be born under Mars, actors under Jupiter, scientists and doctors under Saturn. The psychologist H.J. Eysenck, a thoroughgoing materialist and behaviorist, accepted a challenge to check these results and was amazed to find them sound. He wrote a book, Astrology, Science or Superstition, with D.K.B. Nias, in which he acknowledged this. Why should people born under different signs of the zodiac have different characters? Is there some cosmic factor that changes from month to month? The stars cannot be responsible. They are so far away that they can have no plausible influence. In effect, they are merely the figures around the face of the clock, merely there to help you tell the time. The planets are closer, but their gravitational pull is minimal. For Cotterell, the obvious culprit was the sun, that roaring ball of energy which sends out the equivalent of a gale-force wind. This is why tails of comets stream behind them as they approach the sun, and sunspots, the dark patches often observed toward the sun's equator, radiate a blast of magnetic particles, which cause radio interference and the aurora borealis. Cotterell set out with the hypothesis that astrology works because the magnetic field of the sun can affect human embryos, particularly sunspot activity. Biologists know that the Earth's weak magnetic field influences living cells and can affect the synthesis of DNA in the cells. So it seemed to Cotterell highly probable that changes in the sun's magnetic field affect babies at the moment of conception. Astrologers to whom he explained his theory were dubious, for in astrology it is the moment of birth that stamps up with our characters, not the moment of conception. But Cotterell was not actually contradicting this. He was saying that a baby conceived in, say, June is already stamped in that moment with the Pisces characteristics with which he will be born 9 months later. Because the sun is made of plasma, superheated gas, it does not rotate uniformly. Like the Earth, its equator rotates almost a third faster than its poles, 26 days to a turn as compared to 37. So its lines of magnetism get twisted and sometimes stick out of the sun like bed springs out of a broken mattress. These are sunspots. Cotterell was excited to learn that the sun not only changes the type of radiation emitted every month, but that there are 4 types of solar radiation that follow one another in sequence. So the sun's activities not only seem to correspond to the monthly astrological changes of sun signs, but also to the 4 types of sign: fire, earth, air, water. Because the Earth is also revolving around the Sun, a 26-day rotation of the Sun takes 28 days as seen from Earth. The Earth receives a shower of alternating negative and positive particles every 7 days. When Cotterell was appointed to a job at the Cranefield Institute of Technology, he lost no time in feeding his data into its powerful computer. Powerful for the 1950s. He wanted to plot the interaction of the sun's 2 magnetic fields due to its different speeds of rotation at the poles and equator, and the Earth's movement around the sun. What came out of the computer was a graph that showed a definite rhythmic cycle of 11.5 years. Since astronomers compute the sunspot cycle at 11.1 years, it looked as if he was getting close. The sun's two interacting magnetic fields come back to square one, so to speak, every 87.45 days, which Cotterell called a bit. Looking at his graph, he saw that the sunspot cycle repeats itself and goes back to square one every 187 years. But there is a further complication called the sun's neutral sheet, the area around the equator where north and south balance out perfectly. This sheet is warped by the sun's magnetic field, so it shifts by 1 bit every 187 years, giving a total cycle before it goes back to square one of 18,139 years. And every 18,139 years, the sun's magnetic field reverses. This period, Cotterell could see, broke down into 97 periods of 187 years, consisting of 5 major cycles, 3 of 19 times 187 and 2 of 20 times 187. It was when Cotterell noticed that 20 times 187 years amounts to 1,366,040 days that he became excited. He had become interested in one of the Mayan astronomical documents known as the Dresden Codex, which the Maya used to work out eclipses, as well as with the cycles of the planet Venus, to which they attached tremendous importance. The Maya declared that Venus was born in the year 3114 BC on 12 August. This seems to have been the point when some passing meteor caused it to revolve anti-clockwise. They calculated using the period called Tzolk'in, 260 days, and according to them, a full cycle of the planet Venus amounted to 1,366,560 days. This, Cotterell noticed, was the same as his number, 1,366,040 days, plus 2 Tzolk'ins. Yeah, it is plus 2 Tzolk'ins. Yeah, exactly. Was it possible, he wondered, that the Maya had somehow stumbled on his recognition about sunspot cycles and that their highly complex calendar was based on it? And had they added the 2 extra Venus cycles to underline the importance of Venus as well as sunspots? There was something else that made him feel he might be on the right track. He had noted a rather curious fact, that the sun's magnetic bombardment intensifies during periods of low activity in sunspot cycles. This seemed contradictory. Surely you would expect it to be lower. The reason, he concluded, has to do with the belts of radiation around the Earth known as the Van Allen belts, which were discovered by space scientist James Van Allen in 1958. These are due to the Earth's magnetic field, and they trap solar radiation, which would otherwise destroy life on Earth. Cotterell's own explanation was that the Van Allen belt becomes supersaturated during periods of high sunspot activity, so preventing so much radiation reaching the surface. On the other hand, in periods of low activity, it all reaches the Earth, and he thought this probably causes infertility and birth defects. The Earth was receiving maximum bombardment in AD 627, which was about the time the Maya began their slow decline. But AD 630 happened to be the end of the lesser Mayan cycle of 3,744 years, which began from the birth of Venus in 3114 BC. This was also the time the sun's magnetic cycle reversed. According to Mayan experts, the end of the great Mayan cycle of 13 Bactuns is on December 22, 2012, when the sun's magnetic field will again reverse, and we shall, possibly, face some catastrophe. However, the nervously inclined should note that a complete sun cycle, 18,139 years, would, taken from a starting point of 3114 BC, actually come to an end in AD 4367. So we probably have more than 2,000 years to go. In Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, another Mayan expert, John Major Jenkins, has arrived at his own assessment of the date of 2012. As we know, the daily path of the sun across the sky is known as the ecliptic, and the 12 constellations know what? I just noticed you said no. Know what? Um, anyway, the daily path across the sky is the ecliptic, and the 12 constellations of the zodiac from Aries to Pisces are located along it. Our solar system is part of the constellation called the Milky Way, which is shaped like a giant magnifying glass. If we saw it from above, it would look roughly circular, like a whirlpool, but we see it from the side, so to speak, which is why it seems to contain such a dense concentration of stars. Oh, Libras. Kim K is a Libra. Eminem is a Libra. I'm a Libra. I am definitely not charismatic, so um, the Milky Way crosses the ecliptic not at right angles, but at 60 degrees, near the constellation of Sagittarius. When two planets when two planets in the sky pass one another in the lens of the astronomer's telescope, this is known as a conjunction. On December 21st, 2012, the great Mayan cycle will end when the Sun and the Milky Way achieve this conjunction. The center of the whirlpool is known as the galactic center, where a black hole seems to be located. This will be part of the Milky Way's edge. That will be conjunct with the Sun on December 21st, 2012. What we talking about? I'm reading Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals, chapter 6 or 5, whatever. Um, so he's going through sunspot activity and how the Mayans created their calendar. I actually am an anthropologist. Well, kind of. I have a degree in anthropology, um, but didn't pursue it past the BA level. So I don't call myself an anthropologist. Um, but yeah, I'm interested in all kinds of things, not just mainstream anthropology, which is why I'm reading this. Um, so, did the Maya know this when they worked out the end of their 13 Bacton cycle? In view of their incredible calendar and their mathematical skill, this seems highly likely. Jenkins certainly thinks so. The reason for the earliest dating. By the way, thank you for stopping in. I hope you stick around a while. It is interesting reading. Uh, the reason for the earlier dating, Cotterell explains, is the date given by the Maya themselves is Katun 13, Ahau, I guess, the equinox, which could bring us to December 21st, 2012, or might simply mean the 7,200th day of cycle 13 ending in Ahau, which happens every 256 years, which could take us to 2048. Cotterell explains that his own feeling is that the Maya were so much more clever than we are, they were probably correct about 2012. My own feeling is more skeptical. I find it hard to agree with Cotterell and Arguelles that the Maya were so much cleverer than we are, feeling that their failure to invent the wheel or the arch reveals an intellect that lacks vision and elasticity. So Let me read this. Nice. I want to do archaeology, but my university application got denied because I went to college for a year and a half for business admin, but was not interested in that one bit. Had only done this because I did not know I wanted to be an archaeologist at the time. My marks were bad in that year and a half. Yeah, I get that. How long ago was it? Because I mean, I was not a traditional student. I didn't even start until I was 25, I think. I'd have to do the math, but it was around 25-ish. And um, I went to the community college and to get all my core BS stuff out of the way, and then went to the 4-year college for my actual degrees. And oh, you might look into doing something like that where you can transfer as much as possible. Um, Anything you did pass. Um, I don't know. I wouldn't think you'd have too awful much trouble getting into an archaeology program somewhere. Of course, it all depends on where you're at. I was in St. Louis at the time. Got denied 2 weeks ago. Really? I asked them why, and they told me that because I didn't apply straight from high school, did bad. They were saying my college marks matter now. Well, look into a community college. Really, truly, look into that because get in there, take some of your basic classes, do better, and then take a couple of that of oh, you're in Ontario. And anthropology courses are all about environment. Yeah. Um, if you go to the community, any kind of community college, and take like their intro classes and stuff, I really think you can work your way back into it. Uh, it was a really cheap, easy way to get into college because one of the things my problem was I suck at math unless I do it absolutely constantly. Um, so by the time I got to college, I couldn't even really do basic math very well anymore. Um, so I had to start at basic math and work my way up through algebra, and I did it and I was able to pay for it all because I was at the community college and it was like $100 a credit. So I was paying for it out of pocket, and I didn't start racking up student loans until I went to the 4-year college and couldn't afford the credits anymore. Uh, but yeah, it's a very good way to go to get in there or get back into it when you've been out a while. I've been thinking of going back and starting to take some classes again myself. Just I don't know if I would pursue a master's or a PhD at this point, but I've been wanting to go and take some classes, and that's the way I would do it, is go back to the community college. So anyway, continuing on with our reading, pretty bad at math. I would be willing to relearn though, just to be an archaeologist. Also, you should go back. Knowledge is everything. Well, that's one of the reasons I'm doing this reading stream because I'm gonna guess, um, counting all of the books I have in electronic format, I probably have 50,000 books to read. Um, so I'm kind of doing this reading stream just to learn from all those books. So, oh, thank you for the follow. All right, getting back to our reading, I'm just going to start at the top of the page because I think we were pretty close to it anyway. Cotterell explains that his feeling is that the Maya were so much more clever than we are. They were probably correct about 2012. My own feeling is more skeptical. I find it hard to agree with Cotterell and Arguelles, I guess that's how you pronounce that, I don't know. I don't speak Spanish. That the Maya were so much cleverer than we are, feeling that their failure to invent the wheel or the arch reveals an intellect that lacks vision and elasticity. As to their astronomy, they called Venus the twins because they had failed to realize that the morning star and the evening star are the same. Moreover, I feel instinctively that their tendency to condone mass murder, for that is what human sacrifice amounts to, reveals an odd kind of moral obliquity that we see in the Nazi death camps. Do the gods really want streams of blood poured on their altars? I suspect that the forces behind evolution finally tired of these killers and decided to wipe them out before they did any more damage. Thank you for sticking around. And by the way, just as a side note, this stream is listed as just chatting because it's meant to be a chat stream to discuss what I'm reading. So don't feel shy about chiming in. But Catterall's own suggestion that the disappearance of the Maya seemed reasonable. He believes that, according to their own prediction, they began to decline in AD 627, as the sunspot bombardment caused an increased number of birth defects and miscarriages. On the lid of the tomb of the Lord Pakal at Palenque, we see a female reclining backwards with her legs open. Daniken and Chatelaine both mistook her for an astronaut. Below her are two stillborn children, while the sun god licks her with his tongue to try to restore her fertility. When the Maya were more affected, why the Maya were more affected than other American Indians is not clear, but Cotterell argues convincingly that they foresaw and predicted their own slow decline. Jenkins sees the saga of Mesoamerican astronomy as a search for the unchanging galactic center, a cosmic axis, around which the rest of the universe turns. As with many primitive people, the first candidate was the North Pole, with its pole star. It is often known as the nail star, or the sky nail, because it is believed to hold the world axis in place. I've never heard that before. The Olmec astronomers must have been dismayed to find that the pole star changed its position and could not be relied upon. This may well be the reason the Levanta, with its white pyramid, was abandoned. Eventually, it seems, they decided on the galactic center of the Milky Way, but this in itself is a baffling mystery. Since we are seeing the Milky Way edgewise, there is no way of knowing that it has a center. But here we must remember that the Maya priesthood must have included many shamans, witch doctors, who were trained to learn the secrets of the universe in cosmic flights or out-of-body experiences. This is a central point in which we must return. Or to which we must return, sorry. During the making of the television film The Flood, I visited one of the most impressive Olmec sites, Monte Alban, overlooking Oaxaca. The Olmecs were the first to come here about 500 BC, and they sliced off the top of the hill like a boiled egg to create a holy site. Without earth-moving equipment, it is impossible to know how they did it. It is equally hard to imagine how the Zapotecs, the next tribe to occupy the site, from about AD 100, persuaded the Olmecs to give it up, and it seems more likely that they massacred them. And there is certainly evidence of slaughter. There is a building faced with carved stone blocks in which there are human figures in contorted postures. Some of their figures are negroid, like the great heads of Levanta, while others are unmistakably white men, since they have beards. The figures are naked and their sex organs have been cut off. The style is Olmec, but the glyphs on these slabs are Zapotec. Then who were the bearded Europeans who were killed, and who were the negroid males? Did the white gods from the east arrive with African servants who, since they served the whites, would be of superior rank to the ordinary Olmecs? Perhaps the Zapotecs had decided to throw off their oppressors, and there was a massacre. This may also explain why the workmanship of the stone slabs is inferior to that of the Olmec heads found earlier. Those who recorded the massacre were not as skilled as the Olmecs, and Monte Alban then became a Zapotec ceremonial site and an observatory. What happened at Teotihuacan, the great city founded by the Toltecs, once as large as ancient Rome, is equally obscure. This was the place that started Rand Flemath's quest for Hapgood's old North Pole in Hudson Bay, when he guessed that the Way of the Dead, which would point at the middle of Hudson Bay, but extending the line proved him mistaken. On the curved surface of the globe, it missed its objective, but the error proved fruitful, since it led to the search for other geographical coordinates. It also led to the main discovery that if the line of 0 degrees longitude is extended through Giza from the north to the south poles, it can be used as a basis of a remarkable grid in which an astounding number of sacred sites fall at multiples of 10 degrees. This is regarded as Flemath's most interesting discovery, while rejecting from the start his theory that the sacred sites were originally markers set up by Atlantean scientists to measure how far the Earth's crust had slipped, and which were later treated as sacred sites by the post-Atlantean scientists to measure how far the Earth's crust had slipped. Oh, sorry, I jumped back up. And which were later treated as sacred sites by the post-Atlanteans that struck me as too fanciful. But what the 10-degree measure seemed to show beyond all doubt was that sacred sites were built according to some geographical pattern and revealed the existence of some remarkable civilization that preceded any of those known to us. From about 50 BC, and for the first 6 centuries of the Christian era, this giant sacred city north of Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, dominated the life of Mexico. The Aztecs called it the city where the gods were made. Excuse me. When Cortez came there in July 1520, he was fleeing from vengeful Aztecs, and in this ruined city they encountered still more of them. The Spaniards won the battle, in spite of odds of 100 to 1, by making for a man they perceived as the chief and killing him. The rest fled. Teotihuacan was a dead city covered with giant heaps of earth. Cortez thought that the mounds were tombs, and so called the central road the Way of the Dead. In the 1880s, an archaeologist named Claude Joseph Descharnay made his interesting observation that the faces portrayed in its pottery included Caucasian, Greek, Chinese, Japanese, and Negro. There were 7 Semitic types. It seemed that Teotihuacan had once been a genuinely cosmopolitan center. The story of how this great city became an earth-covered ruin has only just started to be understood by archaeologists. This is a fairly old book, if you hadn't noticed. Speaking of the city of the gods, do you believe in God? I'm going to give you the easy answer to that and say yes, and just leave it at that for now. It's more complicated than that. Around the year AD 530, the Earth was subjected to some devastating climatic catastrophe. The sun became dark, wrote the eminent churchman John of Ephesus. And its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Everyone declared that the sun would never recover its full light again. End quote. And a Roman civil servant named Cassiodorus, senator, wrote, quote, "The sun seems to have lost its wonted light and appears of a bluish color. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, to feel the mighty vigor of the sun's heat wasted into feebleness." End quote. What caused this immense catastrophe that in effect inaugurated the Dark Ages, we still do not know. It may have been a volcanic explosion, in which case Krakatoa in the Sunda Straits is the chief suspect. It would erupt at the end of August 1883, and the sea poured into the vortex of boiling lava, causing an explosion estimated to have been equal to 1,000,000 H-bombs. The detonation was heard 3,000 miles away, and the ensuing tidal wave was over 100 feet high and killed 36,000 people. The dust cloud that spread all over the Earth reduced the sun's radiation by 10%. Yet its effects lasted only 3 years, not the 3 decades of the 532 AD event. So it seems more probable that the cause was an asteroid impact like the one that destroyed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. The result was a drought that caused failure of the harvest for year after year, and for the rulers of Teotihuacan this was a disaster, for it was their job and that of their priests to guarantee rainfall and a good harvest. None of these Central American civilizations were remotely democratic. All had an inflexible power structure, with the god king at the top, then the nobles, then the priests. At the bottom were the workers, rigidly confined to their own place. Their feelings about their masters was one of respect mingled with fear. When they began to starve, fear turned to hatred. When the revolt came, the mobs surged into the temples and palaces and hacked the priests and nobles to bits. They took pleasure in smashing their skulls, then dismembering the bodies and scattering the limbs in other rooms and courtyards. Then they set fire to the temples, built of wood and mud brick. How far do we have? Okay, we've got about 6 more pages. Maybe 8. Even sacred statues were smashed. One 2-foot-high statue of a goddess was scattered over 8,600 square foot area. These starving men were expressing contempt for the goddess who had failed to send rain. If these people had possessed the power, they would have torn the whole city to the ground. As it was, wrecking squads tore down walls, overthrew columns, and burned whatever would burn. Compared to this, the barbarian destruction of Rome was half-hearted. We now know that this happened around 600 AD, not a century later, as historians have always assumed. What we do not know is who covered the ruins with earth. It was probably the Aztec descendants of the Teotihuacanos, who continued to regard it as a sacred city and lived among the ruins. Even the Pyramid of the Sun was turned into an enormous hill. In 1884, an ex-soldier named Leopoldo Batras, brother-in-law of the infamous dictator Porfirio Diaz, persuaded Diaz to appoint him inspector of monuments and allow him to excavate the giant mounds. He was no archaeologist, merely a greedy adventurer hoping to find gold. His biggest job was moving thousands of tons of earth, so Batras hired vast gangs of workmen at a few cents a day and even finally built a railroad to move earth. What began to emerge from the largest mound was a magnificent step pyramid, the Pyramid of the Sun. Its base was roughly the same as the Great Pyramid at Giza, although it was only half as high. Toward the top of the pyramid, Batras discovered an interesting mystery: 2 layers of mica, a glass-like substance used in insulation. This was a special mica brought 2,000 miles away from Brazil. Did it serve some specific magical purpose? Whether it did or not, Batras lost no time in selling it. Fortunately, he did not locate the 2 sheets of mica under the floor of the nearby Mica Temple. Since the Pyramid of the Sun is made of a mixture of adobe and stones, Batras did an immense amount of damage, with the result that 3 of the 4 walls are several meters farther in than they should be. The excavations were due to be finished in 1910 for the dictator's re-election, but by that time there was so much oppression opposition to his rule that he decided against a celebration and was thrown out in 1911, retiring abroad. Blessedly, his brother-in-law also vanished from history before he could wreck more ancient monuments. In the corners of the pyramid, Batres had discovered the skeletons of young boys who had been entombed alive as offerings to the gods. An engineer, Hugh Harleston, who surveyed Teo, uh, Teotihuacan in the 1960s and 80s, suggested that it might be a model of the solar system, with the Great Pyramid as the sun and the planets all represented at proportionally correct distances, even out to Neptune and Pluto. He also noted that since the figure of 378 meters had been included so often, the basic unit used in Teotihuacan, 1.059 meters multiplied by 378, then by 100,000, gave an accurate measure of the polar radius of the Earth. As with the Giza pyramid, it suggests that the builders knew the exact size of the Earth. We have no idea of how Teotihuacan met its end, except that it must have been attacked and burned, then buried under rubble. Yet these millions of tons of rubble had apparently been placed there to preserve the ruins of the sacred city. Again, bearing in mind the effort it cost Batres to remove it all, we can only wonder again at the vast labors entailed. We know that the worldview of these Mesoamerican Indians was unimaginably grim. They expected the gods to send tragedy and misery, and since there is probably no better way of inducing misfortune than confidently expecting it, that is what happened. Maurice Cotterell's view of all this is rather strange. He is convinced that human history has been dominated by super-gods, whom the Hindus called avatars, and that these included Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, and Lord Pakal, or of Palenque. Oddly enough, he has since added Viracocha, whose tomb he believes to have been found at Sipan in Peru, Tutankhamun, and the great Lord of Qin, the Chinese emperor who built the Great Wall that cost 1 million or more lives, and was perhaps the most brutal ruler who ever lived. So altogether, we have absurdly little. So altogether, we know absurdly little about the amazing Maya civilization that flourished for 2,000 years. Far less, it seems, than the Greeks and Japanese and Semitics who visited it, presumably for purpose of trade, in the days when the Romans were conquering Europe. Several thousands of miles away, on the west coast of South America, another civilization flourished and then declined. In February 1987, a group of tomb robbers dug their way into a pyramid, quote-unquote pyramid, which looked more like a heap of rubble, near a village called Sipan in northern Peru. It was known as the Pyramid of the Moon. When the ringleader drove his crowbar into the ceiling of a tunnel, it collapsed, bringing a shower of gold. They had discovered one of the greatest treasures since Tutankhamun. The robbers staggered off with 11 sacks of gold, enough to make them all rich, but they quarreled over the division of the loot. One was shot to death, and another went to the police. The ringleader was killed as they tried to arrest him. Unfortunately, by then, much of the treasure had already been sold. Whose tomb was it? Archaeologists decided to call the most important mummy in the Pyramid of the Moon the Lord of Sipan. The Peruvians of the Lambayeque Valley, where the pyramid was situated, have an oral tradition of a king named Nimlap, who arrived from the west on a balsa wood raft, and led his followers inland for a mile, where he built a palace at a place called Chot. A balsa wood king. So that echoes the Quetzalcoatl return. That's interesting. Okay. Oh, eh, I jumped ahead of him in my own mind. Like Quetzalcoatl and Kon-Tiki, he was worshipped as a god, and when he died, his followers buried him in a pyramid and announced that he had flown away. A Jesuit priest called Cabello, or Cabello, who recorded the ancient tradition, declared that Namelap was succeeded by 11 generations of kings who were also buried in pyramids. This all came to an end when the last of the kings, Fempelek, was seduced by a demon in the guise of a beautiful woman. Aren't they all? After that, the gods sent storms, followed by the great drought. To propitiate them, the king was tied up and thrown into the sea, but it was too late to avert catastrophe. The explorer Thor Heyerdahl happened to be in Peru at the time of the tomb robbery. Heyerdahl, of course, had spent a lifetime investigating quote-unquote ancient voyagers and whether they could have sailed the world's great oceans. He had taken to the plundered He was taken to the plundered tomb by the archaeologist Walter Alva and shown a gold mask with bright blue eyes, obviously not a Peruvian. Was this intended as King Namelap? If so, he was no Oriental. If you don't know who Thor Heyerdahl was, by the way, he built I think it was out of reeds actually. He built a boat and sailed from, um, did he sail from the Red Sea? Somewhere anyway, over there, I think it was the Red Sea. He sailed from there to America. I don't remember what route he took, where he ended up, but he sailed it. He's famous for it. He did that back in the mid 90s, I think. Um, the pyramid was built by the Moche Indians, who flourished between AD 100 to AD 700, and who may be an offshoot of the Mexican Indians. They abruptly vanished. It was not until the 1990s that the mystery was solved, when it was discovered that there had been a 40-year drought in Peru in the 6th century AD, when the heavy rains caused by El Nino had ceased. The Moches had starved to death or simply left. Alva told Heyerdahl of more pyramids 130 miles to the north, at a place called Tucume, Tucume. Uh, I've never heard of that one either. There were 17 of them, and the mud bricks were so worn that they looked like natural hills. They proved to contain no gold treasure like that of Sipan, but they contained something just as interesting. Drawings on a wall showing a raft made of balsa wood. Here was evidence that the builders of the Tucume pyramids were seafarers who had used the same type of raft that Heyerdahl had used to carry him to Peru, from Peru to Polynesia in 1947. But he also did one from Egypt-ish area over into this hemisphere. So, and that was in the 90s. I'm pretty sure it was in the 90s. Maybe it was the 80s. Like the Mexican Indians, the Moche had practiced human sacrifice, as the discovery of 100 hacked skeletons in a pyramid called the Huaca de Luna indicated. Oddly enough, these were clearly not prisoners of war, but Moche warriors who had lost in single combat and therefore been selected for sacrifice to the ancestors. Clay portraits were made of them before they were dispatched with a tremendous blow of a club that scattered their brains, and then hurled down a mountainside for good measure. This raises an interesting possibility that the victims found portrayed on slabs at Monte Alban may also have been sacrificial victims chosen by combat in the ball court. The Incas, who finally became the conquerors of Peru, also had a custom of appointing a child as a quote-unquote messenger to the gods, and sealing him in a mountain to freeze to death. In 1998, the year following the Tucumay investigations, Heyerdahl followed another strange trail that suggested prehistoric voyagers had used the natural currents of the Atlantic Ocean. For a long time, he had been fascinated by an ancient people called the Guanches, who were tall and blond and had built black stone pyramids at Tenerife in the Canaries. One authority, Dr. Ericio sorry, I know I'm butchering this, Dos Santos, has pointed out that their language is related to the Dravidian family of languages from India, and speculated that since they were sheep farmers who disliked the sea, they must have arrived on the Canaries on rafts, complete with families and herds, possibly fleeing from Atlantis, which Santos places somewhere in the region of Indonesia. We are probably safe in speculating that he has the wrong catastrophe in mind, and it is more likely that the Guanches were fleeing from the Sundaland catastrophe caused by Tolman's comet. When Heyerdahl was told about black stone pyramids in the Canary Islands, 700 miles off the coast of Spain, he lost no time in going to see for himself. The pyramids had not been recognized as such because they were step pyramids, like those of Mexico. One was even in the center of Tenerife, but had not been recognized because it had 6 terraces and a flat top. Heyerdahl was able to persuade a Norwegian businessman to buy the pyramids and set up a museum. As to the Tutankhamun tomb found in the Sipan pyramid, Maurice Cotterell had an interesting speculation, noting that one of the figures found in the tomb was a 2-foot-high crab man made of gold. He points out that the crab is a creature that lives between sea and land, where the waves break and create foam, and that the name Viracocha means foam of the sea. This tomb, he argues, would be regarded as, quote-unquote, the lost tomb of Viracocha, in a book of that title. This, he speculates, is the Viracocha of Tiahuanaco. Many kings in Mexico called themselves Quetzalcoatl, and there was even a king Viracocha, but the lord of Sipan is clearly more than a king. From his tomb ornaments, this one was regarded as a god, a reincarnation of Viracocha. Wow, I should have been hydrating. My voice is starting to go. Cotterell's first insight into Viracocha had come in the mid-1980s. On a visit to Mexico in pursuit of his increasing conviction that the Maya had worked out the sun cycles and their influence on human beings. For Cotterell, the tomb of Pascal de Palenque was the greatest revelation. The temple of the inscriptions had been discovered by Father Ramon de Ordonez in 1773. In 1952, the Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz noticed 4 pairs of circular holes in the floor and was able to insert hooks and lift the slab. He found a rubble-filled stairway that led down to the heart of the pyramid. On the other side of a wall, he found a small, square chamber which was almost entirely filled by a huge sarcophagus with a lid. This was a massive and elaborately carved limestone slab, at the center of which was the figure that was later taken by Daniken and Chatelain to be an astronaut. Inside was the Inside was the mummy of Pakal, with the beautiful jade mask over his face. He had died in AD 783. Cotterell bought a scaled-down replica of the lid. Bought a scaled-down replica of the lid. Back in England, he settled down to study it. He started from the insight that his own investigations had revealed, that 260, the number of days in the Mayan sacred year, was the number of days it took for the sun's polar and equatorial magnetic fields to complete their cycle of interaction. It seemed possible that this was the explanation of the Mayan sacred year. This is not, of course, to assume that the Maya had some means of counting sun cycles. They must simply have felt them intrinsically. Cotterill soon discovered that if he wanted to identify various Mayan gods on the lid, he had to turn it upside down. This was logical, after all. On a coffin lid, symbols had to be packed as into a suitcase. Moreover, it was obvious that the borders were also jammed with symbols: bats and jaguars, humans and gods, day and night, birth and death. Moreover, the lid was missing its two top corners, which had to be some kind of clue. It was an X-shaped cross that gave him the next clue. This was truncated by part of the missing corner. Cotterill now had a eureka moment. If you imagined an upright mirror along the right edge, doubling the lid, so speak, I think they mean so to speak, the X would then be completed by its reflection. Cotterill now made photographs of the lid in transparent acetate, and sliding them around, he found he could not only complete the X, but that all the other symbols down the edge were also completed by their photographic mirror images. The same happened with the opposite edge. Half figures turned into full figures. Another symbol on the border was a human face, but down its nose, from the forehead to the tip, there was a kind of long lozenge with pointed ends. When faced with its own transparency, the lozenge disappeared and simply became the usual space between the two noses. Above the faces was the image of a hovering bat, which would have been indistinguishable as a mere half-bat. Moreover, if the two transparencies were laid on top of one another at an angle, a face with two eyes was suddenly staring out at the viewer. This is all new to me. By sliding the two transparencies around at various angles, many more shapes and faces, birds and animals, emerged. There could be no doubt whoever had devised the lid, probably Pakal himself, had filled it with visual codes, and the two missing corners were intended to give the viewer the first clue. But this hardly seemed to make sense. Unless someone had invented photographic transparencies back in the 7th century AD, how could a baffled viewer be expected to stumble on this odd visual code? Cotterill decided to try out his discoveries on the experts. However, they felt from the beginning that he was a crank and were dismissive. They made the same objection as stated above, that Pakal could not have intended such a code because he did not have photographic transparencies. Cotterill replied that probably Pakal did not need transparencies. He could probably see the whole thing in his mind's eye. Now, psychologists know that such a faculty, they call it eidetic vision, eidos in Greek for essence. Some people possess it naturally. As we have seen, mathematical prodigies who can tell instantly if a large number is a prime, not divisible by any other number, seem to be able to take a kind of bird's eye view of the number field, and the inventor Nikola Tesla is said to have built his first alternating current dynamo in his head. Pakal must have possessed this ability with visual images. We're almost there. In fact, perhaps ancient man, with his mind uncluttered with intellectual considerations, was born like it. That would explain how he noticed precession of the equinoxes. His mind, so to speak, photographed a particular configuration of stars and noticed 50 years later that two of them had altered their position. And the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, seemed to confirm that. It says of these ancient people, quote, "They saw and could see instantly far. They succeeded in knowing all there is in the world. When they looked, instantly they saw all around them, and they contemplated in turn the arch of the heaven and the round face of the earth. The thing hidden in the distance they saw all, without first having to move. At once they saw the world Great was their wisdom. End quote. But then, says the Popol Vuh, the Creator began to have second thoughts. He recognized that what man gets too easily he does not value, so he instituted a change. Quote, let their sight reach only that which is near, let them see only a little of the face of the earth. End quote. So man was made short-sighted, blinded by the triviality of everydayness, trapped in a worm's eye view. Their eyes were covered, this is another quote, their eyes were covered and they could see only that which is close. End quote. Whatever we think about these Mesoamericans and their unfortunate tendency to human sacrifice, we have to agree that they saw straight to the heart of the human condition. And that is the end of the chapter, and once again, he still didn't mention the kingdom of the Neanderthals. So I'm hoping we get to that, because I want to know how he's working that in. We're 6 chapters in, and he's only mentioned Neanderthals one time, and it was in passing. I think it may have even been just in the introduction. So, yeah, that'll be that for this this session. Boy, it took an hour and a half this time. That's all right. We'll pick this up on Sunday for the next chapter. So I'm going to end this session and take a quick break, and then I will be back to play. What day is it? Thursday. Fallout 3. So again, I'll end the session. I'll start a new one in a few minutes. So I try to keep them about 5 to 10 minutes max. But I also end the reading stream and start a new stream just so I can keep the stuff separate. You play Fallout 76? I am actually playing something that continues the game after the end of Fallout 3. So you've played it, so I'm not giving anything away. You know, you go into the chamber, or you send somebody into the chamber to start the purifier for the water, and you die, and that's the end of the game. Well, apparently I have a mod loaded. I loaded several mods. I don't remember which one this is, but it continues the game after that. You actually wake up in the hospital a couple of weeks later, and it continues on. So I'm playing through that. So it's interesting. You're working with the Brotherhood and fighting the Enclave. So I don't think so. It's a mod. I'm pretty sure it's fan made. I had to have downloaded it from Nexus. I don't remember any of the mods I loaded mentioning anything about the game continuing, but it is what it is. I'm playing it, so that's where we'll go. I'll be back in a few minutes, so I will try to be back by it's 10:40 my time, so 10:50 my time. So I'm on Mountain Time. So I will be back, and I hope you stick around. Prepare to die.